Hello, I'm Adam Echter, author of Beating Inflation. Welcome to our conversation today. Excited to share the knowledge myself and co-author Herman Simon, founder of Simon-Kucher and Partners, have managed to put together here in a book. A lot of folks have asked us, what was the inspiration? Why would you write a book like this? I think what you're looking at is a manifestation of a lifelong interest in the topic of pricing, value, currencies, money, etc. Herman was a German professor working with his doctoral students in 1985 when they founded our firm, Simon-Kucher and Partners. I've been interested in money from a very young age. I always found it fascinating how Marty McFly, things were so much cheaper when he went back in time than the time I was living in. And I didn't know what was the cause of that. Turned out inflation plays a big role. So I went on to study the topic for many, many years, ultimately advanced degrees in finance, and then had the chance to come here to Simon-Kucher and Partners, a firm that focuses on pricing and value, where we've dedicated the last decades of our lives thinking about this topic. And so between Herman, myself, fellow colleagues from around the world, bringing in ideas that are prevalent in nations that have a sustained inflation all the time, we've had the chance to codify that, put into a text that should help anybody here, particularly in the North American market, is how we've geared this one up to help think about the inflationary effects, what's going on, and ultimately stay ahead of that inflation wave and beat inflation. So what is inflation? That's probably been the most common question we get asked. I think a lot of folks will look at that and look at prices and go, it's the cost of things going up over time, correct? That's actually the opposite way from how we think about it. The inflation is really your dollars are becoming less and less valuable. You're devaluing the currency. So it's going to take more of them to buy goods and services in the future. And that's ultimately what this is all about, what we're going through, and why it's really important for businesses and individuals at the management level to understand what's taking place. Because what this means for our businesses is that the 2020s are going to be materially different from the 2010s. The 2010s were a wonderful time. For the first time in history, the Fed met or exceeded its goal of sustained 2% inflation. They came in a little bit under that for the entire decade. And so we saw the benefits of that in low lending costs and a lot of expansionary economic activity. You whipsaw in the 2020s, inflation is back up to a sustained level. Now, it's not runaway inflation in America, but it's higher than we've seen in many lifetimes of working individuals. If you go back to the 1970s, it actually is very common. If you look at the rapid onset inflation that took place there and you overlay that to today's inflation, they look almost identical. Now, what else can you learn from that? Is that there was a sustained higher level of inflation over that entire decade. And we make the case for that inside of the book here, that given the factors that are driving this inflation, we think it's going to stay with us for a little while. And that puts you as business leaders in a mindset of thinking about addressing something for a period of time. And again, this isn't runaway double-digit inflation, but we do believe we're heading into a decade where, seeing numbers that are a little bit more elevated than we're used to. The most current figures I saw had a 6 hanging on the front of them. We've seen numbers as high as 9s, and that's sort of a range that we might see for a while here. And that's what it means for businesses, being prepared to operate in that environment. So we also get a couple of questions around common myths and what's going on. I think we started to allude to the first one. The first myth was that this would be transitory. If we hunker down, it'll pass and we can survive inflation. I think a lot of us are starting to see that that's not exactly accurate. We're already starting to see some victims of inflation in the headlines these days. If you look at what's happened for those who maybe saw it coming but chose not to act quickly, they're dealing with the consequences of that right now. Probably the next number one myth we've been trying to work through over the last few years is this idea that you can't push price, that if you push your price, everyone's going to go away. Well, price and value should always be going kind of checked and aligned. The idea of pushing price or never pushing price, we just got a little bit lax on it in the 2010s because we didn't have to grow that way. But absolutely it's something you can do. And certainly in an inflationary environment where all of your competitors, everybody else is feeling the same inflationary effects, your price increases are not because you're trying to put more dollars in your pocket for abnormal profitability. You're doing it because you're going to need more of those dollars in the future to buy the very exact same things you're getting right now. That's that idea of the currency becoming less valuable. So you need more of it. And ultimately, this is about survival. And so this idea of pushing prices in an inflationary environment is not out of greed, it's out of survival mechanisms and the need of a company to continue being a going concern. We take a look in the book and go through how most companies in America make a lot lower profit than most people think. We're about 5% on average. And if you overlay that with a 6 to 9% inflation, suddenly half of our companies are no longer making real profits. We're upside down. That is a real threat to our businesses. And so this idea that inflation is going to pass or it's not that threatening, that's a big myth to worry about. And then finally, once people realize that and they take some action, we saw a lot of that in this last year, particularly companies that held out for a while, and then they just went ahead and made record price increases, or they did 3 or 4 or 5 in a row, things that they hadn't done really before. And they did it about 100% of their cost recovery. In the long run, that's not sustainable. So we take an entire chapter and break that down and show how if you look at things like elasticity, while it's always company specific, it's always market specific, we go through it for several different industries with common data points and elastic information that we've discovered and worked on through the decades here at Simon-Kucher and Partners. And we show and demonstrate how sustained 100% cost increase pass-throughs for inflation is not a sustainable strategy. When you start to think about inflation and then you start to think about elastic responses, you start to come up with a ratio that looks more like 50% of your increased costs can be passed through. 20 to 25, you should be able to offset through efficiencies in production and within the organization. And regrettably, in the short term, about 25 to 30%, you're probably going to have to absorb. You can start to see that as well right now. The 2022 figures are in for the stock market. You're seeing revenue at record numbers up about 5%, but profitability is down about 3%, about 8% swing. We think that that's the manifestation of the money illusion or the effects of inflation taking hold. And it's something that you have to be mindful of, that you can't just pass things on 100%. You do have to slow down that total pass through over time. So what's the best way to respond to inflation? Ultimately, it comes down to agility, single word. We can look at the 2010s as a period where a lot of companies allowed their pricing departments to atrophy a bit. They didn't really have to worry about it. They were growing in different ways, usually volumetric manners. But as you look into 2020s, they need to have the people, the tools, the processes in place to keep up. It's really where the focus is going. So that's a wonderful response. If you're doing it, keep on that track. And that's something that you should be thinking about here as we look at the forward-looking world. As a leader or anyone in a leadership role who's thinking about this, it's all about a sense of urgency. As we mentioned before, we do look at the threats to businesses that inflation is going to cause, and we think it's much bigger than people expect. It's ultimately the executives in a company and anyone in a leadership role who can help rally the rest of the team to take action that's going to help you get through this. And ultimately, that's what it's all about. So if people are thinking about how should I respond, it should be a heightened sense of attention and urgency, and then the agility to get it done. There's questions around what types of businesses benefit the most. I think many of you can see in the headlines how inflation affects different businesses at a different rate. We saw the commodity-driven businesses affected first, then complicated assemblies in the middle, and now we're working our way through those labor-driven businesses like software and business services, where the wage labor in the cycle start to kick in, and they need to react. Ultimately, they all have to do the same couple of things. So the top 3 things to think about in this environment is, first and foremost, understand where you are and what your price value position is. I think a lot of people hadn't invested the time to do that. And if you look in the last year, when all of a sudden you got these record price increases with no loss of customers, probably demonstrated you really don't know where you are. There's a lot of methods you can use to get a handle on that. And this would be the time to get that done, because this is not the time as the inflation wave hits your business to start thinking about transforming your pricing power and making radical change. You need to know where you are so you can take the tactical steps. And that gets to number 2, building responsiveness and taking tactical steps. That can probably manifest in the short term in things like fees and surcharges. Those are non-product price adjustments, terms and conditions, raising the price and increasing the frequency at which you do that. These are the sort of things in the immediate term people are getting through. Then we go through some of the mid and long-term items in the book, whether it's switching from a transaction model to recurring model, outcome-based pricing, switching some of the elements that will benefit in the tailwind of an inflationary environment. And then finally, it's easy to talk about pricing in this, but let's not forget our sales team. they're going to have a very different world than they're used to. And we have to be sure we're giving them the tools and the coaching and the support to be successful, because they're going to have to go and do bigger increases more frequently in an emotionally charged environment. That's an incredibly difficult environment to be working in. So be mindful of your sales team, what they're going through in this environment, and make sure you're giving them the tools and the support to be successful with these gains. So ultimately, people are asking us, how can companies survive? I think that gets to some of it. That it can be boiled down to just be prepared for a sustained inflation. And when you start thinking about that way, if you go through and consume a book like Beating Inflation and look at what's going on, it really gets you in that position. The big takeaways and the benefits you get from reading it, it's going to articulate what inflation is and how to think a little bit differently about it, give you the tactical steps as to how you can act in the environment, and increase the chances that you and your company are ultimately successful in beating inflation. Thank you for your time and attention today. Hope you enjoy the text.